You are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt är livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Lisa Åsimäki. The Earth is currently undergoing a period of rapid environmental change. In the marine environment, this change is most notable as increasing temperature and of ocean acidification resulting from anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. Professor Bethanie Carney Almroth is a researcher at the Department of Biological and Environmental Sciences here at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Her research focuses on the effects of pollutants in aquatic environments, focusing on microplastic, particles, chemicals, and effects in fish. Welcome, Professor Bethanie Carney Almroth, to the program. Did I say that correctly? Almroth.
Almroth in Swedish, Almroth in English is how we usually say it.
You're actually American?
Yeah, I was born in New York and I lived in the States till I was 22, and then I met a Swedish man and I came here, and that's the rest of the story.
There you are. So welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm really curious about finding out a little bit about what sustainable development means to you.
Okay, well, so that question is definitely connected to my expertise, which is in animal physiology, how animals' bodies works, and then ecotoxicology, which is the study of chemicals in the environment. And that field of research looks at sources and fate of chemicals, and it also looks at impacts, which is where I work with animals, like how are the pollutants that we are releasing into the environment affecting animals. And most of my work is done on fish, so a lot in aquatic systems, both in freshwater and saltwater. And that sort of sets the ground for my understanding of one area in which humans are affecting the planet, like all of the pollutants, chemicals, and particles, and waste and litter and debris and all of these things that we're doing in the environment that are affecting organisms. The question about sustainable development, like what is that? And that is, so first we need to understand like how humans are interacting with the environment and how our activities are affecting the environment, and what is going on and what do we need as a base to stand on to function properly. And I think a really good framework for trying to understand that in terms of like the natural science side of things is the planetary boundaries framework, which came out of Stockholm a number of years ago. And that tries to understand how human activities are affecting functioning of the planet in such a way that it could potentially threaten our ability to thrive and survive. And they're identifying things like climate change and loss of biodiversity and ocean acidification and pollution, among others. So there's 9 different boundaries. So sustainable development would be a way of trying to change the way we do things in our societies, our economic structures, our societal institutions, our consumption and production, extraction practices, and what, like all the things that we're doing in society that are making society like a healthy, safe place for humans to thrive without causing all of this damage in the environment.
And so how does that relate to the work you do with the teachers in the vocational education program?
So when we talk to the teachers in this program, we usually use the Brundtland Commission as a base in understanding sustainable development. And the Brundtland Commission identifies these 3 aspects that we usually talk about. And that is environmental, which is where I do most of my research, social, and economic. And these 3 bits sort of had to fit together. So we have to have economic systems that are thriving and functioning so we can support all of the social networks and so on, and people can earn livelihoods and support themselves and their families. We need to have social equity where we have people that are safe, that are not being mistreated, people that are not being exposed to dangerous workplaces, they're not being exploited. So people are being protected and they're thriving. And then the environmental aspects where we're not destroying the environment that we really are intimately dependent upon. And so we take these 3 aspects, we bring them into the classroom and talk to the teachers. And the teachers are talking with students that will have future careers in a lot of different sectors where changes can be made to help increase sustainability. So then we can help the teachers try to look at their courses and their students and try to find ways to incorporate these 3 aspects of sustainability into their teaching, hoping that the students can bring this with them into their future careers.
Wow. And so what do you think are the major challenges in the field of sustainable development for teachers?
Well, I would say sustainable development in itself is very complex. And it's global, and everything we do has repercussions, and every change we make has other repercussions. So understanding the entire system and what we're doing and like the long-term consequences of the choices that we're making is difficult. And all of that is very difficult. So it just trying to cook that down into something that we can bring into a classroom of high school students is not an easy thing. But we just have to sort of pick it apart and take like smaller questions and use those to exemplify the bigger picture and help the students to understand, okay, if I work in the restaurant industry and I'm using food ingredients that contain palm oil, like what does that mean? And what does that have for consequences? How does it affect human health? Where is it grown? How does it affect people or biodiversity in the areas where the product is being produced? Can I change that for something else? What are the consequences there? Does it have economic impacts? These sorts of things, like just sort of taking one very small little question that is very maybe central to their work and then look at it in a bigger context.
It's a challenging.
Yeah.
So here in Sweden, they're very particular about, how the food is made, and there is very much about the quality of the food produce, and even the fish. And so, what do you think? Do you think Sweden is on the right path, or what is the real thing that we need to concentrate on, here in Sweden?
So my area of expertise right now, which I didn't mention earlier in terms of my research, is plastic. So I've been working for the past 10, 12 years with microplastics, with plastic products and chemicals in plastics. And that is very central also to food production in a number of different ways. And I think Sweden is starting to look more and more at how we can have more sustainable food production and, as you said, healthy food production and high quality food production. But Sweden does import a lot of food, and the average Swedish person has a very high carbon footprint. We're using 4 globes. So we're over consuming what we should be in order to have sort of sustainable behavior. But if we can look at our food systems, and we can look at how we're producing them, there's a lot of plastics and chemicals used in agriculture and food production. There's a lot of packaging materials, a lot of transportation of food products across borders. And if we could look at how we're producing food and how we can produce enough food for the population, but at a lower cost to the environment, and then we can move forward. So there is a lot of work being done. But we live in a cold climate, so we're likely going to have to continue importing a lot of our food products. But there's a lot of work being done, for example, in the aquaculture sector and trying to produce sustainable marine proteins. And I mean, in Sweden, we have access to a lot of food, a lot of different kinds of food and healthy food, as you said. So we can easily say, well, I'm going to be a vegan and eat lower on the food chain, or vegetarian. I'm going to take a lot of meat products. And in doing something like that, taking away some meat, even if not all of it, will vastly improve your carbon footprint because it's much more expensive to eat higher up on the food chain there. But for a lot of the world, marine proteins are essential. For a lot of the world's population, that's the only protein sources that they have. So we have to find ways to produce proteins for the world's population in a way that is not harming the planet. We can't continue fishing the way that we do because we're fishing all of the fish out of the seas. So looking at circular aquaculture systems that are like co-producing different species from different levels of organization, like algae and filter feeders like mussels or oysters together with fish, and trying to use all of the nutrients in that system, and then look at how we're storing them, what kinds of materials we're using in the infrastructures there, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work being done, and Sweden is a country where there is a lot of research and a lot of technology development. So we can sort of push the field forward.
That's positive. Now, what do you think then about the voices that seem to exaggerate or contradict and deliberately, if you like, provide incorrect information about the risk of our consumption and behavior? What's your response to those kind of claims?
So this is a very big problem in society where we have different information streams coming to us. There are a lot of nefarious actors out there with goals that are maybe not in line with everyone's best. And I know there is research looking at things like if you can call it vaccination against misinformation. If you
Yes.
can understand the techniques that these people or these actors are using, then you're better equipped to spot it and to understand that it's not truth. For example, there's a woman named Naomi Alexis that wrote a book called The Merchants of Doubt, talking about how industry, like the big tobacco industry, were one of the first, used disinformation campaigns. They used paid for scientists to produce their own research that conflicted with the mainstream academic and industry research, showing like, oh, maybe we're not really sure. Maybe we don't really have all the answers yet. Maybe there's not consensus here. And these are techniques that are used to delay and to stall. And they've been used very successfully in a lot of different sectors, notably now the fossil fuel industry. But if you can understand sort of perverse incentives, why would an actor be doing something like this? The answer to that question is usually money.
Exactly.
And what are they winning, and what are they getting me to do, and what is this costing me? Like, if you can try to spot that kind of disinformation campaign, maybe you can be more resistant to it. But it's obviously not been very successful. There are a lot of people in the world that are led astray by these kinds of campaigns, and it's very difficult for our societies to handle. I think there's a lot of problems there in what fishery sciences are producing. So you might have like ecologists looking at systems like we have on the Swedish west coast in Kattegat and Skagerrak, or if you have in other areas, saying like, this is what the ecosystem looks like, this is what the ecosystem can support, this is what this population of this species is reproducing like, and so on, and this is what we need to do to protect them.
Yeah.
Then you might have fishery scientists that are looking at fisheries, like fish populations, as a resource rather than a part of an ecosystem. And they might have slightly different data because they're coming at the question using different methodologies and different theoretical assumptions. But then translating those like fields of research and that data into a policy decision has been very, very difficult. And again and again and again, you will see fishery scientists coming out and saying, we need to reduce our catch numbers. And then the numbers come out and they're increased. This has happened so many times. So we want to catch fish to feed people, but we also want to catch fish to make money.
Yes.
So there's this incentive there, and that one seems to be dominating and driving these decisions because we're fishing the oceans to extinction. It's a problem, and that's why we have to find other ways of feeding ourselves and other ways of producing marine proteins. Can we culture lobster? Can we do that in a sustainable manner? Can we culture cold water fish? Like salmon is one of the world's most cultured species, and there has been a lot of work to improve that. There have been a lot of problems associated with aquaculture, but there's a lot of work to reduce those problems and to try to build a sustainable production of marine proteins.
Mm-hmm. So what are the chances for the development of really sustainable seafood, if you like, marine, where, we're not going to have, if you like, the lack of seafoods that people like salmon?
These are hard questions. And since my research has strayed a bit away from that into toxicology of plastics and materials, I think I could refer you to some aquaculture experts to dive deeper into those questions.
Maybe I need to just put some references on the actual page so that people can go and look at. Because the thing is the hard questions, that's where I think a lot of the misinformation also develops. Because, and of course, and this is where researchers, I guess, are faced with, you are asked a question and you may not be able to, like you just did, I can refer you to expert in the area. And so that's kind of is, it is a problem. But which brings me to your area, which is of interest, and it's really important, is of course plastics. So can you talk about, now, can you just explain, you got this incredible, interesting word, what is it called? Ecotoxicology. What is it?
So that's a word that is built on the word ecology, which is the environment and the different matrices in the environment, the water, the sediment, the organisms living there, abiotic factors like temperature and UV light and sunlight, and then toxicology, which is the study of chemicals and how chemicals can be hazardous, like which mechanisms are driving their toxicity. But then to bring this into this field of ecotoxicology, you have to understand how chemicals are getting into the environment, where they're going, how they're behaving, how they're getting into organisms, and then what kind of effects they have, what the consequences of that are. So when it comes to plastics, we're looking at sources, like how are plastics getting into the environment? Where are they being lost from our infrastructures? And it's through the entire production chain from production of raw plastic materials. So that's like crackers from fossil fuels producing pellets or nurdles, as they're called, that can be spilled in transportation or from production sites, and then to manufacturers or producers of the products that we're using and the entire value chain there. The consumers see the products and during a very short time span during their life cycle. So the consumer's ability to affect this is fairly limited. And then from the consumer's hands into waste management infrastructures that are functioning more or less. In some places, they don't exist at all. In some places in the world. And then once they get out into our rivers and oceans, like where do they go from there? Where do they end up? What happens to them? And then what are they doing to the animals or the algae or the microorganisms and the bacteria? What is happening with these materials in the environment? And that's important for us to understand if we're going to produce evidence to drive policy. So politicians are not going to want to make decisions that could potentially be unpopular or economically costly if there is not a reason for it, because it is costly. There are costs that are being paid outside of like the business model, and those costs are being paid by the environment, and they're being paid by human health. So just as an example, there can be almost 10,000 chemicals in plastic products. 2,400 of those have hazardous properties that can be toxic. A lot of chemicals in plastics can cause hormone disruption. They can be one of the driving factors in development of certain kinds of cancers. They can affect brain development in children. And we know that the healthcare costs in Europe of these chemicals is in the range of billions of euros every year in terms of healthcare costs and lost revenue and lost income. So they are extremely costly. They're just not being paid for by the companies that are producing the chemicals. So if we're going to look at sustainability in our economic models, that's something we need to look at. If we're going to look at sustainability in social aspects for human health, then we need to look at that there. And then for the environmental impacts, obviously, we need to see what these materials and chemicals are doing in the environment and try to prevent harm.
So what is the health of our oceans around here in, for example, around Sweden, the Baltic Sea, and what's the situation around for us?
So the Baltic is notoriously polluted. There are a lot of legacy pollutants that have been dumped in the Baltic for decades, going back to the Industrial Revolution, really during the time of what's called the Great Acceleration, when human populations came into a big growth period in terms of the number of humans on the planet, but also our consumption of planetary resources and our release of chemicals and harmful products into the environment. But so the Baltic has been like a sinking ground for a lot of chemicals going back to World War II. We're talking about mustard gas and explosives. And then today, even the ships that are down there with their tanks full of oil that are sort of leaking out into the environment. And then there's all the chemicals that are coming out from sewage that is in Sweden fairly thoroughly treated, in other places not as much. So there's a lot of sources of chemicals coming into the Baltic, and there's a very low rate of water exchange there. So they're accumulating in the sediment and in the water. And then pair that together with over-eutrophication, so a lot of nutrients that are coming into the system from agriculture, but also sewage and runoff from land, changing the way nutrients are cycling in the environment, changing the organisms from the base of the food web, so the kinds of algae that are growing. This can create dead zones. It can change the kinds of vitamins that exist in the environment, that can change the reproduction of animals higher up in the food chain. And then couple that with overfishing. So we have like all of these problems all in the same place, and we're not being kind to our Baltic Sea, and it's not doing well. It's not.
Mm. So what would be the first thing you would suggest that we do?
Oh, geez. The first thing, I think, so there's a lot of things happening right now around questions of biodiversity and of climate change and of pollution. And I think we need to see some really drastic and bold changes. I think we need to change the way that we're consuming Earth's resources. I think we need to change the way that we're structuring our societies, even maybe our economic systems. I think we're standing at a time in history when we need to make drastic changes. And I think they will need to come through policy. Because I don't think voluntary action, or I know that voluntary action is not going to be enough. It's already been proven to not be enough. There are a lot of big industry producers that have promised to do X, Y, and Z and ended up, for the most part, doing a lot of greenwashing. We need to see some bold changes.
So what do you think the bold changes we need to see here in Sweden? What do you I mean, I'm thinking about, we had the environment, we had the Department of Climate that was looking at issues of climate change and some of the effects of our behaviors and how we live, and they apparently, the department is being closed. What do you?
I don't know exactly what the repercussions of that will be, but I find it, just from a signaling perspective, that very dangerous, because the government that we have right now is telling us that we're not prioritizing these questions. And I and I hope I'm wrong, and I hope they will be prioritized, but just in a different format. But it's not looking good from the outside right now. I very much look forward to them proving me wrong and proving all my worries unfounded. But I am concerned because the problems are very big, and we are destabilizing the very planet we live on. Once we have polluted all the air and all the water and all the food, we're not going to be able to have anything left to eat or drink.
And where are we going to move to?
Yeah.
So, and this is, of course, I'm coming to what message, so think about our future teachers. What's the message? Is there a message of hope, or is it all doom and gloom? And this is...
No, there has to be hope. There has to be hope. And that's why I love this program, because so I talked about needing to make drastic changes, and we're going to need to see a lot of steering through top-down policy decisions. But that being said, I think that all of us need to make changes, and all of us can help make those changes and drive those changes. So in each of the careers that these students will have in their futures after they've gotten their educations, they will be able to go out into those markets and into those workplaces and try to drive change in small ways. And each of those small ways will add up to something bigger. And this sort of bottom-up grassroots kind of change can also drive change. So we can have like a top-down steering of the changes we need to see, but also a bottom-up. And people that are better educated and better willing to make changes and understand the changes that are necessary can help drive that. So I think this is extremely important. And every one of these teachers that goes out and talks to every one of these students can plant a seed of change that they can bring with them and start affecting in their futures. So I see that as very hopeful. And I'm very excited to work with this kind of program, to reach these kinds of students and to inspire them to help make things better and to help drive this change.
And you are much appreciated. I can assure you of that. So, Bethanie, is there anything you want to add to the discussion that is important to you that I haven't even mentioned?
I can tell one story,
Yep.
a disinformation story, that whenever I tell this to people, they get a bit surprised. And it's a very small little story. But working with plastic pollution, I'm working in a few different aspects of this. And one of them is, what kinds of littering items are we finding in the environment? How are they getting there? And that's in an attempt to try to identify, like, where are these things leaking out of society and how can we prevent that? And the most common item found in the environment all across the globe in all surveys is cigarette butts. And what a lot of people don't know is that cigarette butts are made out of plastic. I think a lot of people think they're some sort of like fiber, cotton maybe, or something like this. But they're actually plastic. They're made out of a synthetically changed cellulose fiber. So they're a plastic material, and it's the most common littered material in the environment. That being said, once they're in the environment, they sort of disintegrate into the fibrous materials that they're made of. So they're a major contributor of plastic fibers in the environment, so microplastics. And they can also contain, if they're unsmoked filters, new filters, 4,000 chemicals. If they're smoked, 7,000 chemicals. So lots of chemicals in there, and a lot of them are toxic. And just a very small number of filters in a body of water can be toxic to the animals living there. So they're the most common littered item in the world. They're toxic in the environment. They're a major source of microplastics. People don't even know that they're plastic. But do you know why we have them on cigarettes?
No.
Most people would assume that it's a filter to protect us from harmful components of the smoke we're smoking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you would assume, and that's what most people might think. But back in the 1940s and 50s, when the tobacco industry was sort of creating this big tobacco industry playbook, like, oh no, tobacco is not cancerous. They knew the whole time that it was. They were just running disinformation campaigns to delay legislation, which obviously has caught up with them. But they also were trying at the same time to make a filter that would reduce cancer risks. They were unable to do this. But they found that the filters gave people a false sense of security. So they thought they were being protected. So they use them as a marketing tool. Cigarette filters are a marketing tool to make people buy more cigarettes. They have no human health benefits. They can even be potentially harmful.
And I'm just thinking about the new idea about the vipers or...
So these vapes, yeah.
Yes, whatever it's called.
Yeah, and they're made out of plastic, and they contain batteries with the precious metals. They become a waste material, and then you have the same harmful effects of inhaling the particulate in the product itself. So they're like three ways of bad. And speaking of consumerism and consumption of products and the negative impacts that are paid in other places than the company. So those costs are paid in human health. They're paid in environmental degradation. They're paid in toxicity and pollution. Yeah. And just a final note to add that these changes will be difficult and that no one is expecting any person to be perfect, but all of us can do a little bit. We can all make some big changes, but we can all make some small changes. And of course, we're all still going to do things wrong and things that have costs. But that's, I think, part of the big picture. It's the structures that we live in, because it's difficult to make changes that are beyond your power to make. So we have to continue existing in the structures that we live in, and then just try to change those structures.
And so what's next for you? Are you continuing researching in plastics?
Yeah. So I'm working with microplastics toxicity. We're looking at bioplastics to see if we can find materials that are better or safer than traditional fossil fuel-based plastics. We're also looking at chemicals and recycled materials as a way to try to help inform chemical toxicity, what kinds of chemicals are on the market, maybe which chemicals we need to take off the market. Maybe we need to sort of simplify what our products look like so that we can better and more safely reuse them and recycle them without these sort of toxic chemicals cycling through our structures and systems. We're looking at doing a lot of international collaboration with countries in other parts of the world, because a lot of these structures are global. So we're working with a number of countries and small-scale recycling facilities in the global south. Right now we're looking into trying to fund projects working with e-waste, so electronic waste, and recycling in the informal sector, which is very important in some countries. So there we're looking with collaborators in India. So working with chemicals, working with plastics, working with ways to support change. So what levers can we pull on to start driving change?
Thank you so much, Bethanie, for your time this morning, and hope to talk to you again sometime.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I hope the students like this new aspect to their education, that they can take it to heart and take it with them into their futures.
And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt är livet i Sverige, or in English, That's Life here in Sweden, with me, Lisa Åsimäki. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.